Okay, let's go ahead and begin. So on Wednesday, your homework number 10 is due, and we've got the second midterm exam. We'll go over that slide again in just a moment to refresh our memory about the parameters of that test. And then the project is coming up in a couple of weeks, so hopefully you've made some progress on that. Today we're going to be doing another analytical tool that allows us to choose from among alternatives, payback analysis, and it comes from chapter 13 in the book. Any questions on these schedule items before we move on? All right, so one last look at the instructions for the exam. It's going to be in class on Wednesday. You should bring your computer because there will be at least one question where you need to use Excel. And when you do, you have to start with a blank workbook, not a previously solved example or homework file. And you're allowed to bring one page of notes, meaning one piece of paper, the front and back of that same piece of paper. It should be letter size. And you can put anything on there that you like. There's no restrictions on the notes. So anybody have any questions about the exam? Yeah.
Is payback analysis going to, is that
Yes.
how it could be?
Yes, it is. Yep. So everything in the course from the very first day until today is fair game for the test. More practically, though, I'd say it's emphasizing material since the second exam and reaching back to the bonds. Yes, bonds. You know, some of the things that you learned in the first part of the semester, like time value of money calculations, it would be hard to exclude that because it's a piece of what we're doing in the second part of the course. So, for example, finding the present value of an annual series, like that's mainly something we talked about in the first part of the class, but it's also a component of the analyses we've done since then. So basically, be prepared for anything, and you'll be prepared. All right, so we'll do that 48 hours from right now. And my goal, remember, is that time should not be a factor for the majority of people. I think people will, in general, be finishing early. But then if you haven't gotten a lot of reps on certain procedures and you're still just kind of like right on the margin of understanding it, then maybe 50 minutes won't feel like it's enough time in a situation like that. Okay, so let's talk about payback analysis. And let's just say that it had some initial purchase price to buy a steamroller, and that you're going to be using borrowed money in order to finance the purchase, and it's at some certain interest rate that the loan has been borrowed. And you know, or estimate at least, that some new net revenue is going to be coming in each year. And by net revenue, what we mean is taking into account the operating expenses, which include maybe maintenance and fuel and insurance and so on, that the leftover revenue after paying for all of those expenses, so the net revenue is the justification for the initial purchase price, so it's some amount of money per year. So with all these three things, actual numbers behind them, we could answer the question of how long it's going to take for this loan to be fully paid off. And it's useful to know that because we may have information on how long the equipment is expected to last. And so think about in terms of decision criteria, like those rules that tell us what decision to make on whether to proceed with the project or how to choose from among alternatives. If we knew that the steamroller was only going to last for 5 years, but our analysis told us that the loan would be paid off in 7 years, then we have a real problem. Like if the expected lifespan of the equipment is less than how long it takes to pay it off, then that would argue in favor of thumbs down. Don't do it. Don't buy the equipment if you can't pay it off in the amount of time it's going to last. So this is the kind of question that can be addressed with payback analysis. Is just analyzing how long for the loan to be fully paid off, and then the most common way we'd use that information is by comparing it to the useful life. So here's an illustration we've seen before. Remember when we did the calculations related to unrecovered investment balance? I think it was that food truck in-class exercise, you know, the picture of the food truck where they were selling those really expensive hot dogs. So we went through a process in that in-class exercise in the past to look at how when you have borrowed money to purchase an item and then the loan accumulates in the first year of operation, then the unrecovered investment balance gets higher, and then what brings it down each year is the net revenue. So I show it again because we had these different columns that allowed us to determine at the end of each year how much unrecovered investment balance there was. How much money we had either borrowed from the bank, hadn't yet been paid back, or if you were using your own money to spend on this, the way to think of it is just you could have had your money someplace else and earning a certain interest rate at that other location, and so your new project has to do at least as well as the second best alternative to be justified. And so we would use a table like this just to understand how much of your own money hadn't yet been recovered back in net revenue each year. So we're going to do something a little bit similar to this today. In our in-class exercise, we're going to analyze projects in terms of how long it takes to pay them off, and this approach can be useful for that, is what we're going to see. And remember, when we looked at this, we were separating out for a payment how much of the payment went towards interest and how much of the payment went towards principal. Because when you find A given P, the annual series, your payment amount is the same every year, but a different fraction of your payment is going towards interest versus principal as time goes on. And the reason for that is when you have a loan amount of $88,000, then the interest on the loan is going to be big. But when your loan amount is smaller, then the interest amount is smaller. And so early on in a loan, when the balance is high, a greater share of your payment is used to cover the interest. And whatever didn't go towards interest is buying down the principal of the loan. But then later in the loan, when you're getting close to exhausting the loan balance, then a smaller fraction of your payment is going towards interest. And more of it, relatively speaking, is paying down the principal. So when you buy a house, just keep this in the back of your mind. When you buy a house, you can do like double payments. You can pay off your home loan earlier if you pay extra each month. And if you pay extra early on in the mortgage's life, then it does a lot more good than paying extra towards the end of the mortgage's life. So like if you put an extra $1,000 towards buying off your home loan in the first year that you've taken out the loan, then that has a huge effect later on down the line because that $1,000 isn't accumulating interest for the remaining 30 years of the loan. But it is much less effective at saving you money if you do it later on. Okay, so let's talk more about payback analysis. There's a couple of terms we have to be familiar with to apply this analysis, and one is the payback period. So N sub P is the number of periods required to pay off the item. So it's just how long for the revenue or the reduction in previous expenses. So savings here, the word savings means how much your previous expenses have gone down by buying a piece of equipment. So the purpose of the equipment is either to generate revenue or to reduce your costs. And so how long it takes for those things to balance out the initial investment plus a specified rate of return, that's what we call the payback period. So we usually talk in terms of like new revenue being generated for a project, but remember that if, for example, you owned a warehouse and you put insulation in the warehouse to bring down your heating costs each month, then you could think of the balancing between inflows and outflows as buying the insulation as an outflow, but then the reduction in heating expenses each month is considered as an inflow to you. Even though it's not actually revenue, it's just a reduction in the money that you would have otherwise spent. So the inflows can either be net revenue or a reduction in previous costs. So in either case, you can calculate the payback period by just basically find N given I, given P, and given A. So remember when we use the built-in financial functions in Excel, there are some where you find P, there's some where you're finding A, but here we'd want to find N. So finding out how long it takes to pay off and bring into balance the inflows and the outflows. Simple payback is pretty rare because it's not very often you can borrow money for 0%. Your parents might give you a 0 interest loan, but no bank ever will. Simple payback would be, how long it would take to pay off the initial investment if there was no profit that had to be satisfied. So it's pretty easy and simple payback because you're just dividing the initial purchase price by the payment, and then that'll tell you the number of periods. Discounted payback is the more common scenario, and that's where we are taking the interest into account when we calculate how long it will take to pay back the item. So we have to be careful how we use payback analysis. There's a hidden landmine in this analysis. Just like how some of the other techniques we've used, like for example, internal rate of return. Remember, there's kind of a hidden landmine there, where you can't use internal rate of return to pick the best project. You can only use it for initial screening. And for the most part, payback analysis is the same way. It's best used for initial screening to determine whether an option is suitable or not suitable. But unless there's very specific circumstances, you can't use payback analysis to know which item is the best. You can only use it to know whether the alternatives are acceptable. And so the decision criteria here for initial screening is if the useful life is greater than the payback period, the equipment or the alternative is acceptable. We're not saying that it's the best, but it is acceptable if the useful life exceeds the payback period. Now, we can use payback analysis for comparing alternatives if they have the same useful life and the same revenue generation. So if both of the alternatives will last the same amount of time, and if they both are interchangeable in terms of how much revenue they're going to generate, then you would choose the item that can be paid off the most quickly. But that will rarely be true. So we mostly are going to use payback analysis for initial screening. And today's in-class exercise shows why that is. It shows why we can't usually use it for comparison. It's because payback analysis only tells you how long it takes to pay off the item, but it doesn't continue analyzing the opportunity after the payback period is completed. And so there could be one alternative that takes longer to pay off, but is also more profitable overall. So we always want to choose the alternative that's the most profitable overall. And the reason why sometimes payback analysis wouldn't identify that option is it stops looking at the alternatives once they're paid off. So we'll have kind of that scenario built in today's in-class exercise to make the point that we have to be cautious about how we use payback analysis. So any questions so far about payback analysis? Let me hand out these papers. Okay, so I've just handed out the in-class exercise. There's a 8% table on the back, because in this scenario we have the situation that the company's buying some equipment that it expects will last for 18 years. And so what I'd like you to do is use the factors on the back side of the paper to do part A, and then verify it on Excel doing the unrecovered investment balance calculations. And so I've kind of prompted you what the columns should be there. Year, amount, PV of the amount, and unrecovered investment balance. And so that is just what we had done in this one, similar approach to that. So in part A, just doing kind of the hand calculations to find out the ratio of P to A, and then looking for the factor that's associated with the ratio here of 92,000 to 11,000. And then I'll give you some time to do that, and then I'll start setting up Excel so that you can verify your calculations to the ones that I'll bring up. Okay, so just to address the first part where you have to do these hand calculations, it's actually as easy as just the ratio of P to A. So 92,000 divided by 11,000, that means the P to A is 8.364. So now on the back side where we've got the, oh, I must not have scanned the factor table. Let me see if I've got it here. No, I don't have the 8% factor table, but you do. So on the back side of the paper, go to the P divided by A column, and what we're looking for is where does the P divided by A, where is it closest to 8.3? So if you look at the factor table where it says present worth P slash A, it starts off low and it's getting closer and closer to 8.3. So for 14 years, it's 8.2. For 15 years, it's 8.5. So what that tells us is that the payoff period is between 14 and 15. So it takes 15 years for it to be fully paid off, because at 14 years, it's not quite yet paid off. So in the 15th year, it is paid off. So that's why I say the payoff time here is 15 years. Okay, so then the next part is to use Excel. Let me start setting that up. So from the hand calculations, we learned it should be 15 years when it finally goes into positive territory. So we kind of know that's what we're expecting to see on the spreadsheet, 15 years. So here's the spreadsheet illustration. What it says is we're just doing the PV of the amount, where we're treating each one of these $11,000 in revenue as though it's a single lump sum inflow. And so it goes into the FV column in order for us to find the PV of it. So we're discounting the future revenue to the present at 8%, which is the given interest rate for the problem. And we want to find out, if we're paying $92,000 as an outflow, when do we get back $92,000 worth of value? So it's not when do we get back exactly $92,000, but when do we get back the present equivalent of $92,000? So we have to discount the future revenues. And what this shows us, it's what we had already found out from the hand calculations. It transitions from a negative unrecovered investment balance to being positive after 15 years. And so the payback period is 15 years to be in the profitable range. So the formula here is it's the cell above this year's unrecovered investment balance plus how much present value of revenue came in this year. So each year it's going to be coming down a little bit, and the future value, the present value of those future revenues is getting diminishingly small. You know, like the reason why the PV of the amount is getting smaller and smaller and smaller is what we're talking about is $11,000, for example, 13 years in the future. So if every time you move that $11,000 back 1 year, it loses 8% of its value, then by the time you get to the present, it doesn't have much present value. The economic equivalent amount of $11,000 13 years in the future is about $4,000 in today's terms. So it's bringing down the unrecovered investment balance at a smaller and smaller amount with each year because the present value of the amounts are getting smaller. But the main question here was, you know, does Microsoft Excel verify what we wanted to know about the payback period? And the payback period, yes, is it takes 15 years for it to be fully paid off. You know, it's between the 14th and the 15th year that would occur, but there are no like intermediate numbers of years, like the revenue is coming at the end of each period. So it comes all at once at the end of the 15th year. Any questions so far? Does anybody need to see a certain part of the spreadsheet? Okay, so and it was saying use Microsoft Excel and the function NPER to verify that. So let's see how the NPER function works. So Excel can be used to calculate present value, future value, payments, or it can be used to calculate the number of periods. So let's try the NPER function. Okay, so I'm just putting in that text as a label. Here, when we actually do the function, it starts off equals, as all of our formulas do, NPER, parentheses, and then it starts to give us the little reminders on what it wants to know. So it wants to know the interest rate. I can either type in the rate or I can click on the cell that has it. So 8%. And then it wants to know what is the payment each year. The payment each year is $11,000. So I can either type in $11,000 or click on a cell that has that amount. Okay, comma. Now it's asking what's the present value. Type in negative 92,000 or click in the location. And now there is no future value in this. We're treating each of these as payments. So I can just close the function and it says 14.4 years. So 14 years it wouldn't quite yet be paid off. 15 years it is fully paid off with some additional revenue as well. All right, so I'll put in a little annotation here. This verifies that the payback period is 15 years to be in the profitable range. So even what was this equipment? It says, it doesn't tell us what kind of equipment it is, but it tells us 18 years is the anticipated useful life. So, conclusion. Since this equipment has a useful life of 18 years and a payback period of 15 years, it is acceptable. In other words, we can buy and pay off this equipment before it wears out. So thumbs up on this equipment, whatever it is. It is potentially justifiable. Okay, so that's the first one. So we use the table lookup factors and the crossover point to where, we're looking for the P/A to be equal to the ratio that we determined. And then we calculated the unrecovered investment balance and used the NPER function to verify the other two methods as well. All right, so part 2 on this problem. Let's consider a different scenario. We've got machine X and machine Y, and this is going to show you why you can't just pick the item that has the quickest payback period. Payback times alone aren't necessarily going to identify the equipment that is the most profitable. So we know that when we compare alternatives like this, we have to, in this case, use the LCM method, least common multiple. Do you remember that? Where if we've got 7 years for one item and 14 for the other, in order to compare the two, we have to repeat machine X twice. So we're going to do a spreadsheet analysis here with the unrecovered investment balance, like we just did in the prior example. And machine X is going to have to be repeated twice. So we want to know what's the present value of both of the alternatives, and then how does the unrecovered investment balance look for each of the alternatives. I'll give you a moment to start on that. So the situation's a little bit murky here. Like, which equipment should we buy? Should we buy machine X, which only lasts for 7 years? Or should we buy machine Y, which lasts for 14? Well, if we're doing it right, we keep in mind that this is only used for initial screening. So the question is, are either or both of these alternatives acceptable? So let's look at machine X. Is machine X acceptable? Service life, meaning its useful life, is 7 years, and it's paid off in 6. So what we conclude about machine X is yes, it's potentially acceptable. Machine Y, useful life is 14 years, it's paid off in 8, so yes, it's also acceptable. So the conclusion here is initial screening. Both alternatives are acceptable because their useful life exceeds the payback period. So machine X paid off in 6, it'll last for 7. Machine Y paid off in 8, it'll last for 14. So if we're doing things the wrong way, though, then we'd pick which option to buy according to which one is paid off sooner. So machine X is paid off sooner. Like, one way you look at it, it's paid off sooner if you only do one cycle. If you only do one cycle, it's paid off in 6 compared to 8. But we have to repeat the cycles, so that's one complicating factor. And then the other complicating factor is that machine Y has a higher revenue for the second part of its useful life. So that's a little bit confusing as well, that for whatever reason, in the early days of machine Y, it's not hit its stride yet. It's only having $1,000 in net revenue each year, but then it goes up to $3,000 in years 6 through 14. So the situation is murky in terms of which one is best. Payback analysis doesn't tell us that. It only tells us which one is acceptable, and the answer is both. To know which one is best, we can use present worth analysis. So remember, the easiest way to do present worth analysis is with the NPV function. So NPV. So with the NPV function, we put in amounts that are in the future, and it's going to go through the process of discounting them to the present at whatever discount rate we specify. And then we also have to add it with the outflow, which is already at the present. So let's do NPV analysis here. So equals NPV, and we'll put in a reference to our 8% interest rate. And then the range of numbers are the amounts. They're not the PV of the amounts, because the PV of the amount has already been converted to present value. So we'll put in the future amounts. It's converting them to the present, and then we add external to that the lump sum amount that's already at the present. So it's going to calculate $5,730.83. By the way, we could already know that just by adding together all of these values, which are at the present. So remember, I told you that if you highlight a bunch of cells, it'll tell you the sum. It'll tell you some statistics about that. It'll tell you the average, the count, but it tells us the sum of the cells that we've got highlighted here. So if it's already been converted to the present, we could just add this column, not using the NPV function, just simply adding it all together. And it's the same $5,730.83. So that's the present value of machine X. What's the present value of machine Y? Let me do the NPV function on machine Y. NPV at 8% interest. Here's the future values, and adding together the amount that's already at the present, $8,747. So which one to choose? Machine Y. So we should select machine Y because it is the option that yields the highest present value. Machine Y is better. Even though, if we're just looking at a single cycle of each, machine X is paid off in 6 years, but then we would have to buy another one. And so that's part of the reason why it's not as good, is that you're having to buy it twice compared to machine Y, which we only have to buy one time. So this is another tool in our toolbox to allow us to screen for the suitability of alternatives, and to just, sometimes people want to know, how long does the item have to be owned before it's all paid off? And so you'd want to be careful, if you don't have a warranty for the equipment over its useful life. This 14 years, if that's an estimated useful life, and sometimes the equipment lasts for 16, sometimes it lasts for 12, and your payback period is 8 years, then probably all right. You're still going to be profitable. But if your margin of estimation is pretty close to the expected payback period, then you'd want to be a little bit more cautious. So that's it for today. This marks the end of the material that will be included in the second exam. Keep in mind that homework 10 is due on Wednesday. If you've got questions, I've got office hours, so feel free to stop by. I'll see you in class on Wednesday for the test.